Hello, welcome to Modern Papists. My name's Ryan,
And my name's Sean.
and today we're going to be talking about Catholicism in American history, specifically about Al Smith. So, uh, Sean, could you tell us about Al Smith, basically where he comes from? I know most people are going to recognize the name from the dinner,
Yeah.
but I mean, obviously, the dinner is based off that it's commemorating a person. So, who is that person?
So yeah, Al Smith. He's most known as the first Catholic to win the nomination for the presidency at a major party, specifically the Democrat Party. And he has just a classic American beginning story. He's, from New York. That's where all the immigrants is. He's truly like the immigrant story. His parents are immigrants. They came to America. He himself was born late 1800s, so 1873, December 30th. As the story goes, I'm not sure if this has ever been proved. It's kind of allegorical that his parents, after getting to New York, they walked and walked and walked to the Lower East Side, and they chose where they were going to live in New York because they just got so tired they couldn't move another step, and that's how they ended up in that poor immigrant community. It was full of a lot of different ethnicities, primarily Jewish, Italian, and Irish. And I think there's evidence to show that he wasn't fully Irish. He also had some other recent immigrant groups, maybe a little Italian, a little German in there.
So he was,
But that's kind of,
primarily sorry. So he was primarily Irish.
he was primarily Irish with a name like Smith.
Oh, yeah.
Well, so the name is actually English in origin, but a lot of Irish people changed their name to Smith to avoid persecution, actually. I have good personal family friends that they figured out that's why their last name is Smith, was to avoid persecution. They just
Oh,
changed a very stereotypical Irish name to Smith.
oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right, that makes sense.
yeah, it happens. And yeah, so that, and he had a normal childhood, essentially. Well, not really. He had a normal childhood for that time. But one thing, the first, I guess, defining feature in his life was the collapsing of the Brooklyn Bridge. He was born right around the same time the bridge started being built in the 1870s. And in later interviews, he always would say, I grew up with that bridge. We grew up together. When I was a child, the bridge was a child. Until one day he saw the bridge collapse. I believe this was when he was about 13. And he said that was the first time I ever had experienced tragedy. So that's, I guess, his just first major memory. But also around that time was when his father died.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the real big kicker, if you will. Because back in the day, the way child protective services worked is if you couldn't raise children, no one really helped you. The government just took your kids away and gave them to someone else, which is quite sad. And
Yeah.
so, you have 13-year-old Alfred E. Smith here. That's his full name. Walking back from his father's funeral, and obviously Mrs. Smith is crying, not knowing if this is one of the last times she'll ever see her kids. And Al looks at her and says, I will make enough money so that we can stay together. And so
13 at this time?
about 13, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Talk about growing up fast.
Oh, I would have never done any of this. I was still playing GameCube all the time at 13, personally. But yeah, so he did. So he dropped out of St. James Catholic School in New York and started working as a fishmonger on the docks. And so this is really interesting because he achieved so much, but he didn't have an education of any kind, which I thought was super interesting. I learned the hours he worked, and they were insane. He would work from 5 in the morning to 5 in the evening every day. On Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, it was 5 to 5. On Saturdays, it was 6:30 to 5, so just a little bit less than 12 hours. And then he didn't work on Sunday.
Yeah.
And so from all that working, he made $12 a week, which at the time was just enough for him and a few of his, siblings to stay together. And so that's his background. The first encounter of him actually being connected to politics in any way was they found that he had a good speaking voice while he was at the bar singing old Irish pub music, essentially.
So this was when he was at the docks.
Yeah. So a few
He
years
wrote
after
it-
working at the docks, more when he was, well, more than a few. He was probably more about 17 at this point.
Okay.
Yeah. So he runs for state legislator, and he gets in. Um, he just wins his local election. Not too much of a big deal. But it was interesting. They say for his first year or so that he didn't really say anything. He would cast his vote and everything that he was required to, but he didn't say much. Because the man realized he didn't know what was going on. He had so much to learn.
Yeah.
And so they just knew he was that silent guy, Silent Smith in the background. And he didn't like to read either, which was very odd. Most like successful people we hear about, I read a book a week. You always hear successful people say, but that was definitely not the case for Al Smith. But he did like to read the bills, though, which made him very effective. He was very thorough in that regard. And so, the classic tricks people play of trying to throw unrelated things into bills to try to get like laws within laws passed.
Pork
He's
barreling.
very what?
Pork barreling.
Yeah, pork barreling. He was very good at that. Or catching that rather. He wouldn't let that slide, and he just was convincing enough, and so it came to the point where it was time for him to move on in his political career. And so he ran for the governorship of the state of New York for the first of 4 times. He won a total of 4 times.
Wow.
Yeah, and I don't think for the overarching reasons of this video, I don't think we need to go into each election.
Yeah, you don't have to. Like,
Yeah. I sure hope not.
You're kind of the focus for this, especially since we're talking about an individual. It's really like their accomplishments in light of their history, and then how especially how they're Catholic. Now,
Okay.
we don't have to go into each election cycle that he ran, but the fact that he became the governor of New York as a Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, did he get any or much anti-Catholic rhetoric towards him?
So at that time, not so much, at least not on a national stage. In fact, where he came from, it was a celebration because he came from an immigrant community.
Right.
There's reports of people saying for the first time, Irish immigrants heard someone sworn into office in the accent of the old country, which is interesting to think.
Yeah.
Now, there might be newspaper articles of northern New York, very out, away from Albany even, maybe the Augsburg, Plattsburgh area. Lovely part of the country, by the way. I love northern New York. It's a great place. Did some retreats there. Maybe, perhaps, there was some anti-Catholic rhetoric, but even when you go that far north, that's when you almost bump into the French Catholic territory.
Okay, so I guess that makes sense because New York was where all the most immigrants were coming from, coming to from their countries, and you'd have these ghettos and established communities of ethnicities, and a lot of those ethnicities that were coming over were Catholic, such as the Irish. I guess that's not completely unheard of. Because you've got that natural melting pot, how America is the melting pot, but more so in those in a port city where immigrants are coming in, just because you have to live with them and people get to see other people, and there's a familiarity there. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So was there any, I guess, the 4 terms that he was governor, anything that was stand out, anything that stood out?
So this was a time of social reform, absolutely. And a lot of people claim that Al Smith laid the foundation for what would later become the New Deal. And we'll talk about that later because that's really interesting. But he first did it on a state level before proposing it nationally. And so he set up, things like parks and reform. He child care reform. No longer was it the norm for kids to be taken away from their families when their parents couldn't provide. It would be more likely that they would receive help, things of that sort. I believe when he was the governor of New York, he limited work hours, especially for children under 14 weren't allowed to work in factories anymore.
Okay.
Women they could only work slightly over 50 hours. I believe it was 51, which, that's most people in America today only work 40 hours. So the fact that it was reduced from maybe, 56, maybe almost 60 hours a week, it is insane. And it gave, mothers the opportunity to raise their kids a bit, which is fantastic. And so, yeah, he was big on that social reform and things of that on the state level.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's so, as opposed to a lot of politicians today that
Mhm.
talk about like inner city politics and go into like, oh, we got to help the poor, we got to help the poor. And then they don't really know how to necessarily help them because they themselves have not been in that situation.
Mhm.
It seems like Al Smith, I mean, especially with the children and, helping mothers when they're working, like he was in that situation and he was just making sure like, well, I was in that situation, I have that experience, and I don't know what else he did in terms of like suggesting like the bill, like if he had like evidence, because how we do science today and give it to politicians isn't the same way as how it was done 100 years ago. The not to say anything necessarily gets done today
Yeah.
with the appropriate science, but the idea that he what is it, tried to fix what he saw as a problem that he himself experienced and saw other people experience. So it kind of like adds more weight to his, like, he's not just some prop, he doesn't use it as a prop. He's like, this happened to me,
Mhm.
so like that's really cool to see because it's in today's age, it's been so like politics has become very like career oriented, and the people who get there aren't necessarily the people who have experienced the hardships or the problems
Yeah.
that the republic was kind of set up for, in the sense that they're but that's a completely different thing, but we'll go into whatever.
That's a
So
good point. It's a good point. Well, yeah, and there's great evidence that these things took effect. The famous top floor fire incident in New York. I'm not
yeah.
sure anyone out there is familiar with that, but it was a sewing factory essentially. And there's some fire restrictions. Oh, there has to be a door, and okay, people need to be able to get out of a fire, but they were not enforced whatsoever. So at this factory on the top story, a fire broke out, and that's okay. We have a safety door, but no one regularly came to check or inspect it, and the door was locked. And that's just a famous. Some people refer to it as a massacre, even though it was not a human issue. Pretty much, a lot of women either died in the fire or they jumped out the window and
Ah,
died. And so that was one of the things that really kicked. And after Al Smith tried to put in these reforms, and a lot of local, like New York City politicians, also helped with this.
yep.
A lot of that stopped. And I know where I work right now, fire restrictions and like checkups, they're annoying. But go back and hear those stories and how when a fire broke out, so many people died every time. It's, you know, really cool to know Al Smith really helped out with that.
And you said he was a pioneer in that aspect, where like basically what we would call as common sense regulation. So not
Mhm.
not overbearing regulation, but common sense regulation. Um, that just to make sure people are safe. Like that seems that's cool to know that that was something that he did.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was by far not like the only, and
Right. Yeah. It
it
was
was more.
probably a kind of converging issue at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that goes back to Catholic values, the sanctity of human life. I think a lot of good Catholic Americans today, they have read like the encyclicals against, straight up like socialism or something like that, or, straight communism, but they don't realize that the idea of hyper capitalism, of treating people inhumanely like that as cogs in a machine, is also not what the church intends as well. And so he was able to have that compassion for them.
right. And well, it's because a lot of people, when they say like the New Deal, they'll kind of go extreme. They'll take today's politics and they'll apply it to back in the day, when that's not necessarily to properly understand. I mean, obviously, historical context needs to be there, but the fact that he was trying to find the middle ground that our church, especially from our, what we know today, which has been more clarified, like Saint
Mhm.
Pope John Paul II has clarified and criticized capitalism, even though he was a huge proponent of it
Yeah,
against communism. I mean, he was kind of like that's the person you want saying criticism of capitalism, um, but to say like Al Smith trying to find that ground where you have the humanity, but you also want to make sure you have the infrastructure to allow people to get out of being poor, which capitalism enables. So
absolutely. And yeah, when it comes to the New Deal, he wasn't totally in for that ride. I guess we could save that for later. But he actually was part of the Liberty Group, which was against a few of the things in the New Deal. And so he wasn't like strictly he did good reforms, but he wasn't full gun ho, total reform. Because I know a lot of people are looking back at that and saying perhaps we went a little too far.
yep.
Yep.
So okay, let's move on to his presidential run.
Yes.
So, and this is kind of where, like, I guess where a lot of the anti-Catholic stuff really comes in, because you're not just looking at New York, which is more of a melting pot, but you're looking at everybody basically having their opinion about the candidates. And so, uh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the scene is 1982. Sorry, not 1982, 1928. That would have been a real recent election. 1928. And the incumbent is President Herbert Hoover.
Yeah.
And so at the beginning, he's at a disadvantage. There's the incumbent. The economy was actually doing quite well at the time. And so he was definitely an uphill battle from the very beginning. Well, I mean, the kind of when he was coming back, obviously, the 1920s weren't
Well,
particularly.
I'm saying, because you have the Roaring Twenties, but like 1928 was like the last year, and then 1929 happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what crap?
Exactly. So it was good at the time, but so perhaps by not winning the presidency, he saved himself a lot of trouble. Who knows? Um, but yeah, so 1928, incumbent, decent economy. And so he starts. It really seems from day one that his main base of support is cities. Um, yeah, absolutely. He campaigned, and he was a city man. He was very much connected to Tammany Hall. When he wasn't in Albany, where the state capital is of New York, he was in New York City. And so in that presidential election, he carried the majority of the votes in the top 12 most populated cities in the country. And so a lot of people claim that this was the beginning of like Democratic uh, dominance in major cities. There's probably 100 other reasons why that's the case as well, but I could see how this could affect that. Absolutely.
So, what was the? I guess from a Catholic perspective, how was the? Uh, what was his approach as the first presidential candidate as a Catholic?
As a Catholic,
Yeah.
well, it's very interesting because this had never been done before. It's a first time, and so I think he just tried to run normally. Essentially, there's no evidence of him going guns a blazing, talking about Catholicism openly. But it was a different time, and he got a lot of flack from a lot of fellow Christians. Unfortunately, I'm sad to say, a lot of Protestant pastors were very much preaching against him from the open pulpit, declaring him to not be as American, to have a political allegiance to Rome. That was a very common roadside to see people up, was Herbert or Hoover for America, Smith for Rome.
Huh.
Was yeah.
Wow. Like that's wow. That is.
Yeah, it's out there for sure.
I mean, yeah, but like that is such a. Yeah, I'm sorry. Like that. I didn't know about that. that phrase or that campaign slogan, but like that is so
Yeah.
I mean, it lacks so much integrity. It's very frustrating to hear. I mean, even though it doesn't, it's not now, but it's like that's very frustrating to hear because like that's well, okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it's quite on nose. I do want to say that was not one of Hoover's official
Oh, it never
claims.
is.
It wasn't his like catchphrase, but it was of many of his supporters.
Yeah.
And all this like very much culminated at the Oklahoma speech because, as I mentioned, he did very well in cities. He did very poorly in the rural areas where people were very much WASPs, still white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were not having it, and so he, on the trade ride to Oklahoma, the Ku Klux Klan got involved and put a series of burning crosses on the way to try to scare him. He was noted as jokingly saying, "Oh, how do you know I was on this train?" Like they somehow figured it out. He was impressed with that. Yeah,
Wow.
poor guy. And so at the Oklahoma speech was when he actually had to go out and talk about his Catholicism openly. I believe his campaigners actually suggested that he just ignore it, but he, he had a faith to defend as well. He had an obligation as a Catholic to at least defend the honor of it to some extent. And if you want, I have an audio clip of what he said. I'm not sure if you're down for that, though.
Yeah, I mean, and if it ends up being like we can barely hear it, I'll just edit it out. And that'll be okay.
Okay, fair enough. So here we go. Let's give it a go.
I am entirely unwilling to accept the old order of things as the best, unless and until I become convinced that it cannot be made better. While this is a government of laws and not of men, laws do not execute themselves. We must have people of character and outstanding ability to serve the nation. To me, the greatest elements of satisfaction in my nomination is the fact that I owe it to no man, or to no set of men. I can, with complete honesty, make the statement that my nomination was brought about by no promise, given or implied by me or anybody in my behalf. I will not be influenced in appointments by the questions of a person's wet or dry attitude. I will not be influenced in appointments by the fact that a man is either rich or poor, whether he comes from the north, the east, the south, or the west, or by what church he attends in the worship of God. The sole standard of my appointments will be the same as they've been in my governorship. Integrity of the man or woman and his ability or her ability to give me the greatest possible aid in devoted service to the people.
So yeah, I don't know how well that audio came across, but just kind of going over what he said, he did kind of hit it on the nose at the end. Was the declaration that he owed no one allegiance was the main claim about being Catholic. It wasn't necessarily the doctrine, it wasn't transubstantiation, it wasn't indulgences. It was the idea that he was either held accountable by the Archbishop of New York or the Pope of Rome.
Right.
And so at the end, he makes that claim loud and clear. And it's weird to think about it today. I think we have the assumption for the most part that a Catholic politician would not be the puppet, a literal puppet of the Vatican. But back then, that's literally what the belief was. So,
sorry, just to clarify what I was doing, my daughter had knocked on the door. But if you don't research Catholicism, and especially then if you didn't talk to a Catholic and you were a WASP,
mm-hmm.
I mean, you're just going off what people basically said that was probably not true. And, that was, what you had. So, I mean, there's ignorance, giving the benefit of the doubt, there's ignorance there. But it's like, as Catholics today, some people still believe that, which is very confusing because, I mean, we have plenty of politicians who don't do the dictates of Rome. Like, it's not like the Pope says specifically, you know, you are going to do this or you're going to hell or something like that. Like, that doesn't happen. Like, that has never, you know, from our understanding, happened any American politics. Like, it just doesn't make sense. But okay, like that reminds me of like the Kennedy speech though, because obviously Kennedy learned from Al Smith's, you know, run. He seemed to do the opposite. He didn't just let it come about naturally. Like, he hit it at the very beginning as he was running, and he, you know, addressed it at the forefront and ended up getting elected. And even though he had the same stuff that, or similar stuff that Al Smith had.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps, you know, I don't think Al could have known that, you know, like what to do at the time.
Yeah.
But he did walk so Kennedy could run.
Right. Now, I'm not saying like Kennedy and Smith are the same. Like, that's not what I'm saying here. But I'm saying in terms of just their Catholicism being an issue, like, that is that is a thing. So, and we're so used to it now as it being normal-place. Like, you know, a few years ago or a few election cycles ago, we had Biden and Paul Ryan. So Joe Biden, Paul Ryan, debating each other as vice presidents. They're both Catholic. Now, whether or not they're practicing Catholics and what they promote, that's a completely different thing. But they were both Catholics, and that wasn't an issue, even though that was a question during the debate. And it was more of like, you're both Catholic, you know, and then kind of like just asked a general question about it, as opposed to being like, 100 years ago, this wouldn't have happened, or not as cordially. And so it's like, I don't know, that was a missed opportunity, in my opinion, to bring up the fact that there was that we've overcome that type of mentality and to spotlight it. So,
well, it doesn't. No one wants to admit that, honestly. Without trying to get too political, no one wants to admit there was open religious bias. No one wants to admit that there was bias against other groups of people. That's always the question. Were the Irish and Italians discriminated against because they were Catholic, or were, you know, Catholics discriminated because they were Irish and Italian? But
well, right. And so like okay, so like I would say, like when it comes to certain populations, that's true, but there are other populations even today where they're purposely pigeonholed as being, you know, biased against like the entire American history, which whether or not that's true is, you know, you'd have to research. But the idea though with Catholics, I guess my point was just, like Catholics being acknowledged as overcoming and being able to be accepted within the grander culture, not obviously for their beliefs, but just as upstanding citizens. So, and I think that's obviously, you know, that's one of the reasons for this channel, not to promote obviously Catholicism in the sense of politics as specifically, but just as a, you know, we have a history in America, and you know, it should be known, because there's a lot of things that have been great that's happened with us, not so great things that have happened, and that is part of the American story. So
absolutely.
But I mean, with Al Smith, I mean, would you say that Al Smith, like, how would you describe politically in today's terms Al Smith?
What do you mean? Are you looking for a comparison or just a description, or?
So like, so we have, so we'll take like Joe Biden. You know, he's running as a Democrat who's Catholic as president as of right now, and for the 2020 election. So you know, is it because that he's Catholic that people are not like, not because he's Catholic, but let me rephrase this. I'm having a hard time saying it for some reason. So do you think it's because the culture in the Democratic Party has accepted Catholics as one among their ranks, or do you think there's something else that happens?
Oh, that's fair. And how eventually they were kind of allowed to participate in politics. Well, originally, the Democratic Party was referred to, especially in places like Massachusetts, as the Catholic Church at prayer. Or rather, the Catholic group, they were referred to as the Democratic Party at prayer.
Right.
And so at one point, it was a huge thing. But I think over time, the party was less, and I just mean this for all political parties, not specifically the Democratic Party. They decided what they believed, and then anyone who wants to join in what they want to do has to believe those things. And that's the point of a political party, so you can look at their platform and see what you're going to get. So there's not too much diversity in that. And so eventually, I firmly believe, because not to, obviously pick sides, all political parties fall short of the Catholic ideal.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they are and have been allowing things that are blatantly anti-Catholic, and they want people to conform to them. They're, not willing to have the party conform to anything else. And so the title is good, especially since the Catholic demographic is important to get to win the presidency. Trump won the Catholic vote, Obama won the Catholic vote twice, and they all ended up winning. And I truly believe that Catholic politicians who are in the Democratic Party have done conforming to what the party says.
Right. So like we have like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. I'll just pick the cherry pick the two that I think are in my opinion, the worst offenders. Now we have historically like Ted Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
So Ted Kennedy ran as a pro-choice Democrat Catholic. That kind of leads to the whole thing where it's like, all right, well, you have Catholics running in these things, kind of what you're saying, where Catholics are associated with these parties, and then they adopt more of the party than their faith, or at least they, in terms of action. And, we know now, there are several statements that have come out saying, you can't be pro-choice, you can't vote pro-choice, you can't, or else you end up having a grave sin. Obviously, there's caveats. If you have two candidates that are pro-choice, that's a common example of like, all right, well, you can vote for one of them. But the idea, though, that there seems to have been a pattern of Democrats like Biden, like Ted Kennedy, like Nancy Pelosi, where they've seem to move more with the party. And I mean, Nancy Pelosi, to a certain extent, kind of runs the party now as the Speaker of the House. But move with the party and not with the faith, or at least dropping things in the faith. Because you're right, like euthanasia, pro-choice, like there's several things that are just antithetical to Catholicism. So in contrast to like Al Smith, where, he came from the docks and, he bootstrap story and just became this governor and eventually a presidential candidate. And then I guess making that back around, after he ran as president, do you know what he did?
So he quickly was moved toward the private sector, and he joined the company that eventually built the Empire State Building. And so he was very influential in assembling that. That's his crowning achievement post-politics, for sure.
That's great. So both public. So I guess that would make sense because I guess what is it? Kennedy is referenced, and I know a lot of some of the political history just because one of my undergraduate degrees is in political science. So yeah, sorry about that. Sorry, I know I'm just kind of stuff. But the Kennedy was measured, or not measured, but there's an expectation of the traditional Irish Catholic ideal, which is you have a spiritual housewife taking care of the kids, and then you have this business slash political leader as the husband, and then you raise the kids and to, you know, obviously be like their father or mother and so forth. And it seems that Al Smith, although that's not necessarily what he was going for, kind of fits that ideal. Like he may have even shaped it from the standpoint from the Kennedys, because he was that example. He became a politician, and then he went into the private sector and became a business leader. And so, like, that's kind of interesting to see, like, that linear trail of influence, of potential influence. Obviously, we can't necessarily show causal relationships or whatever. But the what was the other thing? So, just to quickly double back into when his father died, and you said it was in 1886.
No, I do not believe that's the year I gave. That, it was at the age of 13. He was born in 1873. So if the math adds up to that, then yes.
Okay, so I took a guess. I'm sorry. Like so the 1886, and so we know that the Knights of Columbus was established in 1882 in Connecticut, and it didn't seem to hit that far down because obviously he wasn't getting support. But do you know if he ran, like if he ever joined the Knights of Columbus?
So he did become a Knight of Columbus. I'm unaware of the degrees. I'm a Knight of Columbus myself. Very proud to be.
So am I.
Yep. And no, I don't believe they were there to help him when he was young. I think you mentioned that. He did join at minimum before he ran for president. And so a lot of people, even now, there's been examples of people being suspicious of not only are you religious or not only are you Catholic, but you are part of a society within your religion. And people, I don't know, they almost get like the idea of the Freemasons or something in their head when they realize it's, you know, so much charity work for widows and things of that sort. Yeah, just
how dare you help children?
Yeah. Honestly. And it was good. And, you know, that's so big to, you know, Father McGivney, the founder, to have, you know, such a high up.
Venerable, by the way.
What? Venerable.
Venerable. Yeah. So he's on his way.
On his way. Hopefully soon. But that's so good. That, in theory, could have helped spread the order. Catholics all over the country seeing this Catholic candidate and realizing that he was part of this new organization called the Knights of Columbus.
Yeah, that I never thought about that. That's a good point. Like,
yeah.
Huh. Because now I'm not going to advertise, you know, for Knights of Columbus or whatever, but they are all over the place now. Sorry, I'm just trying to think of any of the holes that we may have that we had addressed that we said we would talk about. Oh yeah, the New Deal.
Yes.
So did you fill out the rest of what you wanted to say, or was there anything else that needed to be addressed?
Basically, yeah, I believe I covered what I wanted to cover. Essentially, that he kind of laid the foundation with social, you know, reforms, you know, helping people who need it, building parks in the state of New York, safety regulations, all these progressive reforms. When the New Deal did come out, he was noted as becoming part of this Liberty group, and they tried to chalk up anti-support for the deal because he believed it did, you know, kind of restrict some liberties. He believed it went a little too far. He was progressive, but not for the time, but not that progressive, if you will. Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, that movement, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you see it, did not necessarily catch particularly well. Yep. And this was in the 30s. This is after his presidential run. So he was still involved in politics. And yeah, it was primarily, I believe, reached out through radio. But yeah, people, I don't know, they kind of tried to associate him with the New Deal without looking into it. But he did actually oppose the final draft.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay. Uh, okay. Is there anything? I guess is there? Oh, I can't believe it. Okay, sorry. Probably like the most notarized thing of his is the dinner.
Yes.
So I can't believe I was just going to be like, yeah, we're good. All right, no, nope, we're probably not. So, politically speaking, from my background, the Al Smith dinner is the pit stop for Catholics on the presidential trail. It supports Catholic charities, and it's both presidential candidates of the two major parties come, and you got Cardinal Dolan in the middle doing those great big grins.
Yep.
And a bunch of photo ops. Can you say anything about the history of it and how it came to be and why maybe it's now so fixated in the presidential, presidential pathway to the White House?
Mm-hmm. So from what I understand, it was founded the year after he died by Archbishop Cardinal Francis.
Was that, what year was that?
That was, the year after Al Smith died, so it must have been 45.
Okay.
I believe that bishop was also made archbishop in the year 45, so it was very early in his assignment there.
Okay.
And, so from 45, that's when it started, and it really caught, some fire when Kennedy ran, and I believe in the 60s.
Okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the 60s, that's really when it, caught fire, actually became a big deal. I believe that's the first one where both presidential candidates actually showed. I could be wrong on that. And it's become the pit stop for Catholics because it has been a gesture of showing that they care. Honestly, even if it's just for votes, it shows that they're willing to show up and sit there with the Archbishop and laugh and joke. I know a lot of it's jokes now. I'm not sure if it's always been that way.
Right, but Catholic Charities gets a lot of support, and they're Catholic causes. So let's, I guess, in 1960, is that when, so with Kennedy and Nixon, it became a fixture? You're saying that's when it started?
Yes, that's when it became more of a fixture. That's a good word to describe it.
Okay, cool. So I guess just in kind of like a wrap-up fashion, the Al Smith dinner commemorates a man who came from New York City, who didn't have much of an education. His father died early in his life, became a worker on the docks, became a politician that was highly influential in New York, became a presidential candidate, influenced regulation that benefits us today, and ended up the rest of his life working in the private sector, propping up New York and New York City.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's a good wrap up.
As a most important note, as a Catholic. So
and a real one at that.
Yeah. So okay, that's. And do you think he'll ever have a cause for sainthood?
Al Smith?
Yeah, I know it's like 100 years removed, but that's more like 80. But
I did not know. Sometimes it takes long. I did not know Saint Robert Bellarmine was Counter-Reformation. He was not canonized till 1930.
Whoa.
Yeah, I did not know. I think
really, I was like, he's like awesome. Okay.
Yeah, and St. Joan of Arc's only been canonized for 100 years as well.
Oh, wow. I mean, I guess that makes sense. I guess, we're kind of used to this, like, they died, and so the next decade we nominate them or something. But that is definitely a modern, no pun intended, by the way.
Absolutely.
Modern approach to canonizations.
Well, I believe they were both linked to politics, and so when a canonization candidate is linked to politics, they tend to be more careful. But that's besides the point. Al Smith.
I guess that makes sense because you have St. Thomas More too, and then you have they didn't happen immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially you got to wait for things to play out.
I mean, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're, I mean, I guess from the church's standpoint, they want to make sure that the saint, the potential declaration of saint, not making a saint, but obviously declaring a saint, is based on their actual authenticity of Catholicism and not on their political endeavors.
Absolutely.
So
if that were ever to go forth, it would take a while, the canonization of Alfred Smith. I do not hear any chattering about it. I do not hear, rumors of the archdiocese starting the cause. So I'm not going to try to be a judge and declare him worthy or not. But from what I see, there's not an active devotion to him at the moment.
Yeah, I was just asking because it's a
good question. If not formally recognized by the church, he will receive his due reward.
Well, obviously, yeah, with whatever. So without getting into judgment, just too much, I guess. Okay, so is there anything else you'd like to say? Or you just wrap it up and.
I think we're good here. I would like to mention also one thing he's noted. People might get on my case for not mentioning. He was big into the anti-abolitionist.
Absolutely, yeah. That's kind of a thing. Yeah. I think there was an image where you had showed me where they had light. I might put it on here as we edit the video, but where it says like light wine.
Yeah, light wine, light beer.
How dare you like light wine? And there's a cross somewhere to signify his Catholicism, but it's like what?
Yeah, it says Romanism, I believe. They didn't like the word Catholic, and it was just kind of a anti-Al Smith political cartoon. But he was he wasn't a drunkard or anything, but he just believed that people have the right to purchase alcohol, and that was controversial back then. So
right, yeah, that was definitely controversial.
Yeah,
like our controversies have whatever. Let's just say they're more green, but okay. So I guess this was our first go. We're going to try, I'm going to edit this and then send it out. But thanks for taking the time to watch us,
Yeah, absolutely.
This was a lot of fun. I mean, did you think it was a lot of fun, Sean?
I really enjoyed it. Not only like doing it, but I think I like the process of preparing more, actually. They were both great.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, we're learning too.
Absolutely.
Like, it's not just based off solely what we know, but please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. And if you have any suggestions, please let us know in the comment section.
Okay, I'm Sean.
I'm Ryan.
And we've had a great time with you here in episode 1. Stay safe, stay holy, and hopefully we'll see you in episode 2.
Yeah, thank you.